Executive Director of Communications and Development for Foundations, Inc. And I just want to say a shout out to the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation. They are the ones who make this webinar series possible. So we really appreciate their support. I'll give you a little bit of background on Foundations, Inc. We are a national education nonprofit. We're located in Mount Laurel, New Jersey, and our mission is to improve the quality of education by building the skills of educators. So we work across the school day. We work with after-school programs, with school day, even at the state and national level, to ensure that we are creating a brighter future for every child every day. If you would like to learn a little bit more about our organization, you can check us out on our website, and Paula will make sure that's in the chat. You can also follow us on social media, and we hope that you will check out the Beyond School Hours Conference. That's our signature professional learning event. Each year we hold the conference in February. This year we will be in Orlando, February 23rd through the 26th, and we hope that you will consider joining us. So I'd like to welcome back our amazing host, Sean Petty, who's the Senior Study Director at Westat, and our very special guest, Jeff Pullen, who's the founder and managing director of Creative Generation. Thank you both for joining us.
All right, thank you so much. Elizabeth, appreciate the intro and appreciate all the information. And thank you, everybody. I see a few familiar faces that are rejoining us. Thank you for being with us through this entire journey. We're very excited. We just found out that we're going to do one more additional show in January before the big show live in Orlando, Florida. So we hope that you'll join us for the January show and the Orlando show. But right now, I am so excited because I have a very special guest. He's a very, very busy man. We've had kind of fly-by-night conversations, but they've been wonderful. And he is a guy to know in the space and know where we're going in the future. So let me introduce Jeff Pullen. Hey, Jeff, how you doing?
Hey, Sean, it is good to be here. And hello, everybody. It is lovely to see all of your faces tuning in live. And for all of those watching afterwards, I am coming to you from the land of the Piscataway peoples, which is today known as Frederick, Maryland.
Perfect. And how are things going for you? Is the holiday season crazy? Is it calm? What's all going on in your world?
Oh boy, is it crazy. So we work a lot with young creatives and educators and artists and activists. So things are fueled by the calendar year, the school calendar, and we are, of course, an organization, so end of year stuff is very, very real. So wrapping up lots of things and ready for a break. One of our big values at Creative Generation is rest and rejuvenation and creativity, and we find that when we take time off. So we will actually be closing our offices on Friday for 2 weeks.
Oh, I wish more people would believe that. Rest, rejuvenation, and what was the third one?
Creativity.
And creativity. That's awesome. I'm gonna write that down. And creativity. What a great motto. So tell us a little bit. So today we're talking about kind of Creative Generation. This is kind of the culmination of several conversations that we've had throughout the year about just the creative space in general. Tell us a little bit about your organization. What do you do? Kind of like if you were to be a Marvel superhero around Creative Generation and we were to name you a Marvel superhero, what would be your origin story?
Sure. Well, our origin story is one that's not too far in the past, actually. And I'm happy to share a little bit more about my personal journey as well. But that of Creative Generation really began as a research initiative in April 2019, where we began to explore the language, actually, that was used to describe the outcomes of arts and cultural education. Mainly because at that time, we were witnessing folks trying to advance the field of arts-based learning in schools, out of schools, and higher education, and continuing ed, lifelong learning, using a number of different means that, you know, in my personal opinion, were a little bit problematic. In one breath, we would say the arts bring up test scores and you should fund more of the arts in schools. And in the same breath, we would talk about how standardized tests were exclusionary and contributed to inequitable access to quality learning, particularly for Black and Brown young people. And so we were a little bit frustrated with that. And so we began to do some research to uncover some of the complexity and the nuance there. And upon completion of that first study, we both expanded and explored how arts and cultural education can support young people to lead social change on a global scale. During that time, we had actually witnessed how a group of young theater makers led a March for Our Lives on Washington, D.C., one of the largest marches on our nation's capital since the civil rights movement. And they were all young creatives that were using the skills that they developed in their theater classes to change the national dialogue around gun violence and school safety. Now, not to get into the politics of it, but I think we can all recognize that that's a pretty transformative moment and has nothing to do with raised test scores. And so at that time, we put forward these really big ideas to say, we need a new way to talk about this work. We need a new focus for our organizations. And we really need to recognize the fact that young people are learning arts through arts and cultural education, not to be professional artists, but actually to address the challenges in their life every day. So ultimately, we began a number of projects to uncover evidence and demonstrate the need and the potential shifts in paradigm shifts and greater understandings in pedagogies that cultivate creativity, in the organizational practices that empower young people, in the public policies that can support those organizations, and ultimately in the leadership pathways for young people to become the leaders of our world and use their creativity to change communities and nations and our entire globe.
That's fascinating. I love the fact that you backed up to research there, because like you said, a lot of times people are just like, oh, this is good for you, you need to do it. Or this is going to help you do better. It's going to build your creative vibe when you get out of school, but you're actually founding this in research. Have you published that study?
Oh boy, have we. Yeah, we are actually a registered publishing house. So everything that we publish is available through the Library of Congress and through Crossref. So it has those fancy DOI numbers. So any database and universities, can access it. But it is free and open resource. So we're actually a registered public benefit corporation located in Washington, D.C. So everything that we do is intended for free and open resource. So people are encouraged to not only read, but also listen to the podcast, watch the videos, and use the information, develop it, implement it, tell us about it later. We love hearing about how people actually can use the research and the resources that we're able to create in practice. In fact, a little spoiler for those who are watching live in the year 2020, in early January 2022, a bunch of resources will be reshaped on our website into resource centers. So we'll have one that'll be focused on organizational infrastructures and practices. We'll have one focused on leadership pathways. We'll have another one focused on creative youth participating in community development. And ultimately, they're aggregations of different resources from numbers of different projects. But the fun part about each one is that there's a blog function. So every time that we hear of a story or people can share how they use something, we tag it to that so you can actually see in real time how different organizations, different classrooms, different young people and adults are able to use these big ideas that are fairly abstract and implement them in their community and reflect on it.
That's awesome. So, I put the website in the chat room for everybody to go to, the Creative Generation website, where a lot of this material is there. So you started April 2019, and then a year later, the pandemic hit. The pandemic was starting already, but it really went into effect, March of 2020, that timeframe when we kind of closed programs or started to really mitigate with quarantining and trying to slow the curve and what has evolved from that. How did that affect your organization? You were a new startup and then all of a sudden you went into this crisis mode.
That's exactly right. So immediately preceding the world shutdown, I think our last day operating as normal was March 20th. I think March 7th to 11th, I was on a whirlwind trip. I was working on a project with young dancers in the UK, then had a meeting with a potential client in Amsterdam, and then was actually meeting with a foundation that fuels youth-led community development work in Istanbul. So I really kind of like flew back into this crazy scenario, and we responded in a number of different ways. First and foremost, at Creative Generation, we're a collective of artists and educators and activists and storytellers that work together all the time. And so part of our time is spent with Creative Generation, and part of our time, each of us, is spent elsewhere. I'm also a university professor and work with a youth dance company. Other people do other things in the creative and education spaces. But it was really interesting because what we did as a collective was we turned to our values, and we essentially said, taking care of people is much more important than turning out products per se, and shepherding the resources that, the very finite resources that have been invested in these projects to ensure that they actually reach the full potential of what they're intended for was really important. So the first thing we did is we actually chose to furlough ourselves so that we were able to use those wonderful stimulus dollars as part of unemployment, to close the gap. But when we got back working, we did advise a number of our collaborators on how to pivot into the virtual space. We produced some digital conferences. We ended up working in one case with youth researchers where they got, I think, a more robust experience. We were supposed to spend a week with each team of youth researchers in their cities. Instead, we acted as their coach, and they were the researchers and documentarians, and they authored the final reports. And so it was really, really tremendous partnership in new and different ways. But the thing that I'll say really importantly is that we actually collaborated with a group of funders and with another research firm to do some pretty transformative work. The first thing we did was we asked the field, on behalf of a group of funders, how out of school time arts and culture programs should and could be changing as a result of this pandemic. What can funders do to support them? And we heard lots of things. First was to support holistic approaches to caring for people, making sure that people had health insurance, making sure that they still were receiving a paycheck to be able to put food on the table and pay rent. We looked at holistic changes and how organizations were really revisiting their moral compass. And we looked at different new and different strategies of how programs were moving their work online. The second thing we did is we actually spoke to a cohort of about 40, I think it was 41 projects or programs across the United States, and actually a subset of about 15 projects or programs that were identified by UNESCO internationally. And we were able to follow them, what we thought was going to be through the pandemic from March to April, and ended up being through the multiple pandemics of 2020 from March until October. And so we watched as these organizations were responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, the resulting economic recession, the civil unrest because of the violence against Black and Brown communities at the hands of police and vigilantes, and the political turmoil leading up to the 2020 election. And what we did is we actually ended up producing a huge body of knowledge that was published in Arts Education Policy Review, which is an academic journal, but that specifically looked at the ways in which these organizations took one of two routes. And I think this is particularly interesting for anyone who's a program director, a CEO, or an executive director, an organization leader. The two routes that people took were, one, what we called the short circuit route, where they emerged from their comfort zone and were launched into this turmoil and disruption because of these pandemics. And all they wanted to do was curve back around to what they knew how to do, which was deliver in-person, culturally based arts education in their, out of school time program or physical space. Yeah. But what we saw was that most of them actually moved to what we called the opportunity zone, where they emerged because of the disruption from their comfort zone, entered a zone of learning and insight, and then implemented some strategic changes. We saw organizations for the first time have equitable participation in their board decision-making between young people and adults because the meetings didn't happen over lunch. We saw organizations that were music production programs that utilized their very small recording studios as personal food pantries for families that had experienced job losses. We saw teaching artists put on community-based performances and create interpersonal connection in a time that no one was within 6 feet of each other. And so ultimately what we were able to witness was the pivot, probably the most overused term in 2020, but that actually allowed us to gain insight into how organizations can actually be hyper responsive to the needs of the young people and families in which they serve. Because what was happening wasn't necessarily working, and it allowed that major disruption, allowed not only our organization, but others to deal with some really long-standing challenges in new and different ways. So it was really insightful, and there's a whole body of work online about that as well.
That's cool. And, in the course of our conversations, talking about some of your work and the examples that you just shared, you shared very tangible examples, an artist or a creative who got out there and created some connections with community. Someone turned their recording studio into a food pantry. These are very tangible things. Now, your work, though, is a little bit more systems-based, right? And changing the system versus, hey, here's a great idea, go do this. Or here's something that worked for this organization, it could work for you too. You're looking at the bigger picture, is that right?
Yeah, well, sort of. So yes, I would say my personal work day to day is usually bigger picture focused, and our team's work on a regular basis is usually focused on that systems change, the research and documentation, and how we sort of revolutionize, thinking about there's an indigenous methodology that thinks about the future 7 generations down the road, not the future of tomorrow. And we often like to think in that space. However, we really believe that true meaningful change to things like public policy and funding systems and evaluation actually come from the grassroots up. They bubble up and emerge. So I would say with every major big systems change that we talk about, that our public policies need to, be focused on X, actually comes from tangible examples where those programs have sort of found a loophole or a pathway around the problematic policy that we're just demonstrating that change. So oftentimes practice in community centers, at after school programs, in classrooms is actually leading the way. And usually arts-based programs are leading the way of those. You think about evaluation. So many people are trying to tie their out of school time programs to in-school measures because it's this big system that's tied to funding and all of this. But what we know is, like, in the 80s, arts practitioners started doing portfolio-based assessment, where a student systematically grew a portfolio of work that could demonstrate their progress over time. That is something that's just now catching on in other areas of education and youth development. And so it's really interesting because our goal is to find those tangible examples and not scale, but learn from all of them and see what universal truths that can influence our systems can emerge. And then we sort of take it from there. It's a real privilege that we have to work with so many people, and we like to use that privilege in a way that can help give back or help advance the larger systems. And going back to that original research, one of our big findings was that the systems that do govern out of school time creative development, like education policy, arts and cultural funding, all of those things, are pretty broken, and they're incredibly strict. So those shifts are absolutely essential to that 7-generation goal that we're talking about.
That's awesome. I love that 7-generation goal. And thank you for breaking that down. We had a question from the audience that I'm going to bring to you. So the question is, who exactly is a young creative? And they expound upon it. They say, who are they when they enter, like, the creative generation process or the various programs? And who are they when they leave?
Sure. Well, first, I would just be really clear. We don't have a creative generation process or programs anywhere. We are a collective of people that work specifically with people who have been doing this for a really, really long time. But I'll give you an example. A real tangible program is one, if anyone's from San Antonio, Texas, I'm going to speak about a project that we work with pretty closely. It's called Say See. It stands for San Antonio Youth, yes, C in Spanish. And they've been around for about 30 years. And they're an out-of-school time program that began in visual arts and expanded. They have a digital media lab and a theater program and some music making, and they partner with schools and have out-of-school time work. And they actually just built a brand new building that's like a bajillion square feet and youth-owned space. And it's a hub for creative practice But ultimately, that is the type of program, but it serves young people in San Antonio. They're deep, deep, deep in a neighborhood, not working, in by like the fancy shops and, all of the historic downtown, but instead they're in a neighborhood. They create a space where power is shared between the adults and the young people. And the thing that they do together is make art. And through that art, they're able to create a safe and welcoming space. Through their creative practice, they're able to explore big ideas and challenging challenges that those young people are facing in their community. And especially in San Antonio, you're dealing with immigration issues and ICE officers and, all of those types of things. And these young people are people who are, well, first of all young people are inherently creative, but these young people are electing to spend their time cultivating those creative skills, be it in music making, game design, theater, or visual art. And what we know about young people in general is that they are inherently creative. Young people have creativity. And to quote the great Sir Ken Robinson, we often educate young people out of their creativity by putting them in these strict little boxes and siloing our education systems. But what we know at Creative Generation, what we've uncovered from our research, is that there's actually 4 dimensions of creativity. And when we talk about creativity, we don't think about making art, like the simple basics of what are the notes on a musical instrument, or the basics and principles of line and shape and color in art class. But what we're actually talking about is the dimensions of creativity as it's applied in someone's life. And so we talked to about 30 programs in 24 nations back in 2019, and had young people and parents and educators and artists give their input on what those outcomes of creative-based applied learning look like. And they gave us 4 measurable dimensions. The first is around creative thinking, which is about the ability to envision solutions to really challenging problems. The second is cultural consciousness, which is a development of one's own cultural identity and a participation within other diverse cultures. The third is around connectivity, which is remaining connected to peer and social groups, regardless of time or location, which is really amazing about that time or location piece, especially in the COVID years. And lastly is the idea of citizenship, or a concern for community, giving back to the communities from which one belongs. And those are the outcomes that we talk about when we describe young creatives and their work. To go back to the example of the kids from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, they surely were learning musicals and theatrical production skills, no doubt, in that classroom. But what they were able to do is to develop their identity, to persuade people, and to use those theatrical skills to put on a performance that would empower more young people to come together for a cause. What more can we really ask for? I don't care how well they perform a scene from Macbeth. What I care is that they've developed the creative capabilities in order to engage their generation in a movement.
Interesting. And I would agree with you. It's so funny. We focus on so many things that a lot of times we wonder about the application, to that. And these 4 dimensions that you highlighted are awesome. And thinking through it, it really makes the idea of being a creative to have some lasting change in society over, like you said, over generations of time. So this may be kind of an off-the-cuff question, so take it with a grain of salt. But whenever we approach, sometimes when we approach leaders and we're like, okay, we want to give the youth a voice, we want to have them. You had mentioned earlier that maybe they could be a part of the board, like they could have like a specific role to give feedback, or you actually ask them, or in the case of the students from Florida who, use their creative talents to spur kind of a movement or to create a movement moving forward. Sometimes that's a little scary for adults, leaders who are like, how much do we do that? How much, like, what's the balance there? Is there a balance, or do we, because they're still, progressing and learning life, but then on the other hand, they have this voice that's not being heard. How do we balance that? How do we weigh that?
Well, I'm going to give you a really abrupt answer, which is get over it. Young people are the experts in their lived experience. And if we are purporting to empower young people to serve them, then they should absolutely be in those leadership positions and be guiding the project. I'm also a really bad person to talk to about this because I was a youth leader. When I was 14, 15, 16 years old, we were writing legislation and lobbying our state legislature to get 2 young people to sit on our state board of education in the great state of Maine. And that has remained in place ever since. And it created a trickle down effect where, you know, most school boards have youth representatives in the state. And, you know, so I was the young person that could not vote, could not take out a loan, could not rent a facility, but was making the type of change at the public policy level at that age. So if people say young people aren't ready, I think check yourself because you sound like an idiot and you should move on. But I'll give you some of the research behind it. So in 2020, Creative Generation conducted a study on what is leadership in the arts and cultural education space. Our friends at the World Alliance for Arts Education and UNESCO really wanted to understand what this meant. And so what we did is we put together a study that looked at across cultures. So we wanted to understand leadership all around the world. What are some universal truths that might come out? And so we looked at the literature and we found that leadership in our field is often concentrated at the city or municipal level, at the national level, or at the supranational or like global regional level. So we conducted focus groups in 3 cities, Houston, Texas, Bristol, United Kingdom, and Nairobi, Kenya, in 3 nations or states of nations. So in South and Eastern India, in the country of Australia, and in the country of the United Arab Emirates. And then lastly, we looked at 3 global regions across foundations in Latin America, across with the ASEAN Foundation in Southeast Asia, and with the European Union. And out of that, we found a couple of really interesting things. That in arts and cultural education programs, often there's a disconnect between the governance model, which is like the CEO model. There's one leader at the top and then a couple of divisional leaders and then the people. And then the way that arts and culture practice actually happens, which is often a collective of people, an ensemble in theater, a dance troupe, a musical orchestra, a gathering of musicians, right? And so there was a disconnect and it's like, well, what is the problem there? And so we talked to people and we said, you know, so what is it that's actually problematic? And we found a couple of different things. The first thing is that leadership doesn't match. So on a kind of theoretical level, that's not great. But also it tends to lead our organizations astray in one way or the other, because as a field, we naturally sit in a place where sometimes we're balancing between youth development outcomes and artistic practice outcomes. And we need to learn to hold that tension. And so what we found is that where the most successful programs were operating, they were actually observing what we called a distributed collective leadership model, where the organization, the group, whatever, would determine what their goal was, and that they would fill the table with the people that had the individual expertise to achieve that goal. So why would you have one person who needs to have all of these skills in marketing and fundraising and human resource management and whatever, when you could maybe have 4 that are there? And maybe in the next strategic plan over 3 years later, you have a different 4 because the goals are different, right? If all of a sudden you're doing a big capital campaign, perhaps you have someone with an expertise in like fundraising as one of your key leaders. And other times you might be doing other things and you need expertise in that. But it takes an interesting process that has to deal with unlearning and bridging our gaps and holding those tensions that it takes to get there. And observing a distributed collective leadership model, particularly for an organization or a project that quote unquote centers youth voice, well, then we need to have a chair at the table for those young people. And the distributed model of leadership allows for young people to be part of that decision making. We understand, again, those strict systems that govern our work, they're broken. Young people up until the age of 18 cannot sit on a board of directors, right? Because they're not the age of majority. That's fine, but they certainly can be part of the collective that is implementing the organization's work day in and day out, making those operational decisions that do affect the way the work is done. And so there's no reason, one, on a personal level, that young people shouldn't be part of the decision-making process, especially if you're a youth-serving organization. You should know how to cultivate them into those positions of leadership. And secondly, we just need to change the way our our organizations are built, which isn't hard, as demonstrated last year. We saw those changes across the board. So it's absolutely achievable, and frankly, something that we need to be doing immediately.
So any advice so our audience right now, we have a small handful of strong warriors who are joining us today on the call, but we'll have a lot of people listen to this recording later. And one of the questions on their mind is, okay, so, I have this after school program, or I have this youth development program, and I want to empower the youth voice. I want to have them be a part of this. What's your advice about where to start?
Sure. Well, there's a couple of really great models, and we've been doing some research on this as well. We have built a new set of frameworks from Hart's Ladder, which was pioneered by Roger Hart, is often used in SAMHSA and other U.S. government-funded projects that demonstrates sort of the rungs that organizations can move along to create space for young people to be part of decision-making and create effective youth-adult partnerships. But in an arts-based setting, it's really interesting because there's far more choice, right? So we've created sort of a modified version. I'm happy to, it'll be published in early 2022, and we're happy to send it around, definitely have it at the conference. But what's really interesting is that, it is about those decision-making points in our work, right? There's some that have to do with a strategic plan or an annual adoption of a budget, the hiring of certain people. And yeah, you certainly want longevity, you want people who have history and so forth, but there's also decision-making around what should the day-to-day schedule look like? How should we spend our time together at the retreat? What are the types of programs that we should offer next year? Engaging young people authentically in those processes and decision-making are an absolute starting point. Truly, we are going to paint this wall. What color should we paint it? Let them choose. Oh, you don't think that we should paint the wall? You think that we should create a mural? Absolutely. Is it a little bit more expensive? Yes, but I'm sure your budget can handle that. These are the types of decisions that start to build the capacity within, not within the young people, they have the capacity, within the organization to withstand those other opinions, that this power being shared, that's absolutely essential. And then you can get to a place where perhaps you can't have young people who are still minors on the board, but you could certainly have a young alumni. And if they've been part of that decision-making for 3 or 4 years of their time in the program, they know how those processes work. They've built their own knowledge base. They have the history. They're no different than a new board member that's coming from, say, the banking industry.
Mhm. Interesting. So, and everybody on the line, if you have questions that you want me to bring into this conversation, please put them in the chat room and let us know. So as we're working on this, we're working on youth voice and working on creative. Sometimes we get this right now in particular, there's this focus on accelerated learning. There's this idea that, we've lost all this time and we need to make up for it, or we need to, catch up, or maybe we don't need to catch up, but we need to, I honestly, it's hard for me to articulate it because I don't quite understand the concept. Right. Because I'm like, how can you make up learning that, needs to be experienced? But that's the big focus right now. And there's all this American Rescue Plan money out there for after school, for youth development. But sometimes it's being funneled into very, very strong academic supports, which we agree with. I mean, kids got to succeed academically, right? But we don't hear a lot about, arts and cultural education, or if we do, it's kind of like, oh yeah, you can do that. Any thoughts around that? Or I know that might be a hot button for you, but I figure, let's get that out there and talk about it.
Well, first, as an educationalist myself, I think learning loss is a made up concept. I think these constructs that we have are just levers of control that perpetuate a supremacist culture that we certainly do not need in education. It's already there enough. So I think the concept of learning loss is a little bit of BS, but I do understand the very harsh reality that there's a ton of money that has to be planned for and used immediately, and we absolutely don't want to miss those opportunities to do the right thing. So what I would say is that arts and cultural education is absolutely how we should be investing our money, and I'll give you a case study. in New Zealand, there is a research that has come out and a set of resources that have come out from the University of Auckland, led by a team of researchers there that began some research in arts-based interventions to help young people return to school after experiencing a trauma. They started this with some young people that were affected by natural disasters. They refined it after the shooting at Christchurch in Australia, and then further implemented it nationwide. So every elementary school teacher in New Zealand was trained in arts-based trauma-informed practices to help young people return to school after this trauma. It's called Te Rito Toi, which means the seed of the arts, the sheath around the seed is the arts in Maori culture. And it's based in Indigenous practices of healing in their bicultural nation. And it has worked tremendously. And it's free resource online, teritotoi.com or .org. Peter O'Connor has been the principal investigator on it, and it's had a tremendous impact. So why are we not learning from places like New Zealand that have funded arts-based interventions to help the return to school, to help people, young people, process these traumas that they've experienced, to help our teachers upskill so that they have another tool in their toolbox to aid young people in their learning? The arts are a literacy that help us communicate. So why would we not want to have another tool like we do have in, written literacies and oral traditions and histories? Why not have the arts as another way that we can help young people learn and grow and impact their lives moving forward?
I agree. It's kind of funny, if we go back in time, it was the arts and the various aspects of storytelling and visual design and other things that actually led us to where our education system is today. But now that we're here, we kind of push it to the side and say, oh, let's forget all that history. Let's move forward with these concepts that we have. So interesting. It sounds like you've done a lot of international travel and visited a few places around the world that are doing some really cool things, like, the Maori tradition of doing art to deal with trauma-informed care, which is brilliant, by the way. Tell us a little bit about your travels and what you've seen internationally compared to what we do here. And obviously, there's a few stories that you shared with us that we can pick up on, but tell us a little bit, expand a little bit more about that, since you have that experience.
Certainly, yeah. So I have done a lot of travel and also work on several international projects. So we get to talk to folks. It is a very normal day for me to be up very early for a meeting with our colleagues and friends in Seoul, and then be meeting all throughout the day with people in different time zones all across the planet. But that said, there's tremendous things that we can learn. The United States is really plagued with a case of what I call American exceptionalism, that we are the United States, so therefore we are the best at everything. And to quote Aaron Sorkin in The West Wing, I think, we're best at incarcerating women in childhood deaths. So we need to kind of get off that soapbox a little bit and actually look outside of the world. Some of the best education systems are in, Scandinavia. Some of the best investments in arts and culture are in Southeast Asia. And so we need to think much differently and actually learn from the global community. It's very funny that you hear us talk about how we need to be better at science and math. We need to catch up to a lot of, these other countries that are excelling. But why? It's funny because they view us as incredibly creative and they want to change their system to be more creativity based, like we have. So I think that what we need to do is just have a little bit of perspective and learn from our other colleagues. The example I just gave from Indigenous cultures in New Zealand, how can we take some of those lessons and apply it to the Indigenous cultures for the lands that we occupy today, to make peace, to reconcile, to embed and learn from those elders who have cared for the land for so long? How can we learn from each other and cross-cultural ways. I mean, there are certain things that do connect us that are only explored through the artistic and cultural traditions of the communities from which we come. People who hail from the African diaspora, people who come from migrant communities in Latin America to the United States and can trace their lineages to these places, for better or worse, a lot of them are problematic histories. The reality is, though, is that there are cultural traditions that bring us together and can unify our communities in different and new ways that we haven't seen. So instead of forcing everyone to sit, at their desk and write down times tables, perhaps we can help people be experts in what they know. One of my most favorite stories is working with a youth dance program in New York City that's based in social partnership dance. So these comes from cultures in Europe and in Latin America. And they were doing this program in a school in the Bronx that was almost like 100% Puerto Rican. And they were doing a traditional Puerto Rican dance. And those young people, for the first time ever, were the experts in their school. They were the experts in the space. They had a confidence. They, held themselves high, their shoulders back, their heads looking forward, rather than staring at the ground and hunched because they were a little bit lost. So to go back to where this conversation started around like learning loss and investment and all of that, these are all constructs that we've made to fit ourselves into these boxes of what we think we should be doing. When in reality, if we're actually responding to the needs of young people, if we're actually meeting people where they are, and if we're actually developing or cultivating the tools in the toolbox of every young person so that they can address the challenges that they face every day, that's what we should be aiming for. Not, can they answer these 7 questions that were asked 2 years ago? That's silly.
I think you're getting a lot of applause and comments in the chat room that you're speaking truth, and there's a lot of great jewels here. That Chandler says global traditions can lead to global unification, using our history, our past, our ties to culture and art, we can actually look at, who knows, actually having peace, and so some great work here. Want to take a step back. We got about 17 minutes left. And I want to ask a little bit about you, Jeff. You're very passionate and you want to talk your organization, but let's talk about you. Like, how did you start doing this? How were you the kid in Maine who was like, I should be this person, or we should have a voice? And how did you evolve into where you are today? Can you tell us a little bit of your history?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, like I mentioned, I grew up in what I refer to as the great state of Maine. It's a lovely, lovely space. I no longer live there, but it holds a very fine place in my heart. But I grew up in a little town just outside of Portland, which is the large city, right on the beach, and had the really distinct experience of diving into the arts at a very young age. So I have a sister who's several years older, and I followed her into a local dance studio and was put right in class to channel some of my energy at 2.5 years old, wearing my first pair of tap shoes. The routine was, how much is that doggy in the window? And as the only boy in the class, of course, I was the Dalmatian, the doggy in the window. But what I share all of that, and there's on Instagram, I'm sure you can find in the dark histories of social media, there's a photo with I think some sequin suspenders. But really, I share that to say, I had a great experience of being able to go into the arts at a very young age. I was able to move my way into community theater. I got to play Michael and Peter Pan at age 6. I got to fly in a local old theater in an old church. And then went to school where we had an incredibly arts-rich community. We had dance and music and theater and visual art K through 12, including a really tremendous program where graduating seniors do the class was called Children's Theater, and we worked with 5th graders. So as 5th graders, we went through the program, creating plays and acting in them. And then as seniors, we led it in just a community holistic investment. And it led to some very early success. So when I was 16, I was on my first national tour as a dancer and had a kind of unconventional high school experience. And when I was on tour, we were working with absolute greats in the tap dance world and doing residencies in schools. And I realized that not every school was like my school, and not every community had the arts opportunities that I had, and not every young person was able to participate in arts and cultural experiences like I did. And that, with some teenage angst, really fueled a passion to get involved. So when I was 17, I got involved with an organization called the Maine Youth Action Network, which was a statewide program that connected young people to make changes in public policy. And we did a lot of things. We passed bans on tobacco use on beaches. We created skate parks. We lobbied our state legislature to have young people sit on the State Board of Education. And one of my favorite things is that the very first young person who was, I was aged out at the time because I was too old, but they had a rising junior who became the youth on the State Board of Education. His name is Justin Chenette. He, at age 22, became State Representative Justin Chenette and then State Senator Justin Chenette in charge of the Education Committee, and spent out all of his years with term limits in state legislature. And so it's pretty amazing to see that, investment in young people in decision making comes back around. So the point is I realized at a very early age that youth participating in systems change was possible. I knew that young people like myself who had these arts skills could apply them. I mean, there's a really old photo of me leading an activity with state legislators and young people. It was a theater game to break down barriers, to find commonalities. So arts-based interventions in public policy making were absolutely possible. And so ultimately, I ended up graduating and going to college, studying arts management, moving to New York City, as you do. And then I had the opportunity after grad school to participate in a public policy process. So I actually worked, I was living in Ireland at the time, worked with the Irish government on the implementation of their first ever national arts and education policy. And then implemented some of that in different institutions. And then in 2013 was brought back to the United States to work for a nonprofit on a number of different policy fronts, including the arts provisions and the new Every Student Succeeds Act, looking at out-of-school time funding through the National Endowment for the Arts for creative youth development programs, representing the interests of arts and cultural educators with the Obama administration, and really got to bring all of those passions together. And then in 2019, founded and have been working with Creative Generation.
Wow, what a fascinating story, and what a great story that is. So we're here now. Our audience on the line, a lot of us run, individual after-school programs in a school, or at a youth development center, a Boys and Girls Club, or YMCA, or something of that nature. And it's crazy. We're just trying to find staff to work, and we're just trying to make our ends meet. And we all work 12-hour days or longer, and then of course we all have families, and we have a life outside of the work too. I mean, a lot of us tend to live both lives as one, right? But any advice for those on the line, how to really get something started where we can use that untapped energy of the creative generation to start, helping us create amazing programs, to start helping us get this voice out, to start helping make this cultural and societal change that we're looking for? Any advice for those on the line who may be just like, I'm just trying to get my coffee and gonna make it through the day,
Well, I understand that. And I want to just stop right there and actually say, sometimes you just got to get that coffee and just make it through the day. And self-care, if you burn yourself out, you cannot be there to support other people in doing the work. So really, truly taking care of yourself, taking rest. I mentioned earlier, Creative Generation, that's something that we value. We have a quarterly quiet week where we have no deadlines and we take no external meetings, which is really great. We also try to not do external meetings or deadlines on Fridays, so we can have time to just, get through the stuff that we do. But I also understand, counter to that, there's an urgency, right? If we don't help young people who need help, that can be a really tough spot. But the one thing that we actually know about this upcoming generation, so we talk about the creative generation all the time, which is an intergenerational group of people ages 8 to 80. We're not talking about that, but we're talking about the people who are, say, in their tweens and teens today. Now more than ever, they are passionate about making change for their future. and has been incredibly well documented. And so I think harnessing that energy and providing the pathways to help young people chart their movement towards making the change they want to see in the world, right? Not to sound too Gandhi-esque, to use the quote, but the reality is we have a responsibility, and I would argue both a personal and a professional responsibility as the adults, to not tell young people what to do, but not to be fully out of their way either. They are still young people that need that pathway. And no, I'm not using the word pipeline to leadership or anything like that, because that's like a trajectory and like has all sorts of, there's like an analogy that can be drawn with issues and rust and leaks, and all of that. But pathways where young people can truly navigate themselves, they can make choices, they can deal with the very real consequences, positive or negative, but they do have people that are there, the park rangers that maintain the pathway, so that it is clear, that we can be those guides. And that is something, that is super important. So balancing that urgency, with the fact that we also work in institutions, we've created organizations, and we can't forget that our institutions and organizations or programs or what have you are meant to be agile and responsive. It's really easy when we start to get overwhelmed to fall into that space of, well, but this is the way we've done it. This is what's always been done. Here's what the strategic plan says. I'm sorry. I used to love strategic plans. I loved a good strategic planning session. But man, after 2020, just throw those right out the window. Strategic plans don't really matter, right? We can plan all we want, but what we're doing is we're actually looking at the futures. I'm a really, really big fan of a process that's called educational futures, or what's a causal layered analysis. We do not have time to get into this. It's super nerdy, but the point is as practitioners, we can take into account all of the different factors that impact our work: the economy, the grants process, what's happening within the school system, within our neighborhoods, so forth. And actually take time out of our day, every day, to think about all of the possible futures that could happen, limit those to the plausible ones that are likely to happen, limit those to the probable ones like that are going to happen next week, and then pick out of that group, what is the preferable thing? What is what you want to do? And then set your aim on that. And then do that for next year and set your aim on that. And then do that for 5 years down the road. So all of a sudden it becomes a responsive thing. You don't want to say, oh yeah, we're going to have $1 million grant next year. Possible, probably not probable. Definitely preferable, right? But the reality is if we start to actually think about the future in terms of our next step, our step maybe next year, and then our big step down the road, it becomes more manageable. And it can be more responsive and not just keep us in the rut that we've been in. And thinking about all of those things together, really, that's what gets me through the day. We don't have a strategic plan, but we definitely know where we want to go tomorrow, next year, and way down the road.
I love that. And we'll have to expand more maybe in the live show or afterwards, into that. That would be, maybe post some links in the recording. So perfect.
Certainly,
Well,
yes.
we have about 4 more minutes before I turn the time back over to Elizabeth. But tell us a little bit about what initiatives you're working on right now. I know you just recently launched a new initiative campaign called Creativity for Good on your website. Tell us a little bit about that and kind of what you're trying to accomplish and what's next for your vision.
Certainly, yes. So what is next for my vision? Yikes, that is a challenging question. What I am most excited about as we look into 2022 and beyond is that energy, right? We've spent a lot of time learning and documenting and sharing how people have had to respond and to shift. And what we've seen is that there were tremendous learnings during the last 2 years. I think it's really advantageous that we sort of got going at this time, because we do have a really firm foothold in what I joke about as like the before times. And then we had our eyes wide open, learning as much as we could during these years of the pandemic. And I think as we start to pivot towards the future, everyone, I don't know if I can curse it here, but everyone's like bullshit level of being able to put up with it has decreased, and people just want to do the good stuff. They don't want to spend their time on the superfluous, whatever. And that's leveraging some pretty cool things happening both in the United States and all around the world. So I'm excited about the potential of some of the new types of pedagogies, the new types of organizations, the new types of youth leadership pathways that are promising to revolutionize our work. I think we are right on the cusp of some absolutely transformative work happening in our fields. And the thing is, it's happening in out-of-school arts programs right now. And so it's really, really exciting for me to like look at those things and to understand and to vision for the future about what they can be. The challenges, though, and this is what I will issue as a call to action here as we wrap up to everyone, don't miss those opportunities. We are learning, things are changing so rapidly. We're inundated with information. But when there are those gems, write it down on a sticky note, put it in your planner, stitch it into your pants. I don't know, whatever. Do something so that you can remember those things as we move forward. Because if we just go back to that other research I was talking about, if we just go back to what we were doing in 2019, everything that we've been through in the past 2 years is ultimately a waste. And we've learned so much and we've progressed so much. So let's not miss those opportunities. Let's take advantage of them and let's keep going forward.
Wow, well, thank you. You all heard it here. Thank you for those who are on video. I see Helen and TK and Lavasha. Thank you for being here. I've also seen, TK do like applauses and been highlighting great stuff that you said, Jeff. What a great piece of advice. If we were to wrap everything up, it's don't miss those opportunities. Thank you, Jeff, for that sage, and sound advice. We heard everything from, how the creative generation can change our society, can change our using culture to reconnect or change our future. Also, I love the advice about strategic planning, being more agile, not necessarily being stuck in something that we did 2 years ago, but really learning from where we are and moving forward. Lots of gems of advice here. Thank you, Jeff. We look forward to having you on our show live in Orlando, Florida, where Jeff will be joining some other amazing creative individuals who will be up on stage with us, where you, the audience, will get to ask questions. And who knows, Lavasha, I see you have a young person there with you. Bring them along and maybe we'll get their voice at the live show and ask their opinion, So please definitely join us. Thank you, Jeff. If I can't say enough, we appreciate everything that you're doing, all the hard work that you do, your passion. Everything you said has resounded with us and caused us to move forward. And so we will take your advice and go from here. So thank you.
Thank you all very much. It was great to spend time with you and look forward to seeing some of you in February.
All right. And now it's time to say goodbye as I turn the time over to Elizabeth. So Elizabeth, take it away.
Thank you both so much. Again, as I was listening, I just thought this was a really great end of year webinar. I just think that it's a lot of like positive thoughts for going into a new year and really thinking about seizing our opportunities to change the lives of the students that we work with. So thank you both so much. We appreciate your time. I know this is a crazy time of year for everyone. So the fact that you were willing to take an hour out of your busy schedules to spend with us, we appreciate your knowledge and your experience, and we thank you so much. Thank you for everyone who participated. We know that you are also busy at this crazy time of year, so we value your time, and thanks again. We do have a special one in January. We are doing an additional perspectives from the field with Carlos Santini, who is the CEO of Mizzen by Mott. So please look for your emails on that. Check us out at the Beyond School Hours Conference, where we're doing the live show on February 25th. And you can register. I encourage you to get your hotels soon. The hotel is filling up fast. The information to register is in the chat. And again, we just appreciate the support of the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation. Without them, these webinars wouldn't be possible. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful holiday season, and we'll see you in the new year.